What if I told you there's a kind of money that can weigh over 4 tons, never moves an inch, and yet people have been using it for more than 1,000 years? Somewhere out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on this tiny forgotten island, lies the world's very first blockchain. Only thing is, it doesn't run on computers, it runs on giant rocks. This is the story of how one people basically invented Bitcoin way before Satoshi Nakamoto was even born, and how they may have stumbled onto the future of money. Fast forward to the year 2025, you've probably heard of Bitcoin by now. A digital currency that exists purely as code, with no physical form, running on a decentralized network. Sounds pretty revolutionary, right? But what if I told you this revolution actually happened over 1,000 years ago? On the island state of Yap, a small archipelago in Micronesia, right in the heart of the Pacific, there's something that'll flip your whole idea of money upside down. Imagine giant limestone discs, some as big as a house and weighing up to 4 tons, scattered across the island like oversized coins that never budge. Yap sits more than 800 miles from the Philippines and almost 600 miles from Palau. It is, quite literally, in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. With just 39 tiny islands and a population today of barely 11,000, this speck of land developed one of the most sophisticated and longest-lasting monetary systems in human history. When the first European explorers landed on Yap in the 18th century, they were totally baffled. They saw hundreds of these giant stone circles, each with a hole in the middle, scattered all over the place. Some were the size of a coin, others bigger than a car. And the locals? They treated them as money. But here's the kicker. Those coins never actually moved. When someone spent a stone, it stayed exactly where it was. The only thing that changed was who owned it. It was like the value got transferred telepathically. Crazy, right? So, how could that even work? How could a money system work if the money itself never physically changed hands? The answer shows that the people of Yap had invented something we'd only really understand in the digital age. But before we get how the system worked, we gotta rewind to the beginning. And the beginning is an adventure that pushed human courage to the limit. Over 1,000 years ago, the Yapis faced a big problem. Their islands were made mostly of coral and volcanic rock. But what they needed was limestone, a special, bright white stone that didn't exist at home. And it wasn't just for looks. In Yapis culture, that white stone symbolized purity, power, and a deep connection to their ancestors. The solution? A 250-mile ocean voyage to the limestone caves of Palau. Doesn't sound like much today, when we cross continents in hours by plane. But remember, we're talking about people sailing in primitive canoes. No GPS, no compass, no modern navigation tools at all. Palau sits southwest of Yap, and the journey took weeks. Navigators relied only on the stars, ocean currents, and the feel of the waves to guide them. It was knowledge passed from father to son, every bit as valuable as the limestone itself. According to local legend, a man named Anagumang led the very first expeditions to a place called Magaragar, near Palau. He came back hauling these gleaming stones that became the very first Rai or Fei, the stone money of Yap. But carving the limestone was just the beginning of the challenge. The Yapis had to shape these massive discs, some over 10 feet wide, using nothing but primitive tools made of shell and coral. Each stone took months to shape, and that trademark hole in the middle? Not for decoration. It was there so you could slide a log through it and carry the stone. Still, hauling those giant discs back to Yap was an epic mission. The biggest ones had to be lashed between 2 canoes, sailing side by side for hundreds of miles across open ocean. Many expeditions never returned. Men died in storms. Canoes sank with their precious cargo. Families lost their best navigators forever. And it was exactly that danger, that sacrifice, that real possibility of death, that gave the Rai stones their value. It wasn't just the material, it was the story. Blood, sweat, and tears, literally carved into every limestone disc. When the first Rai stones finally reached Yap, something extraordinary happened. Instead of keeping them as personal trophies or fancy decorations, the people made them the foundation of a brand new economy. But Rai weren't used like money as we know it today. You didn't buy fish at the market with a 2-ton stone. They served a way bigger purpose. Instruments for the most important transactions in Yapi society. Weddings, inheritances, conflict resolutions, tribute payments, even ransoms for prisoners of war, were all settled with Rai stones. Owning a big stone with a legendary backstory meant power, status, and influence over the community's biggest decisions. And here's where the genius of the system starts to shine. A stone's value wasn't just about its size or the quality of the limestone. What really mattered was the story behind it. How many men died bringing it back from Palau? Which famous family once owned it? Was it used in some historic event? This was a system built on narrative. Each stone had a biography, a pedigree, its own adventures. And those stories were carefully preserved and passed down orally from generation to generation. It was like each Rai stone was a historical NFT, with its provenance meticulously recorded in the collective memory of the people. But here's the wildest part. How could these giant stones be spent without ever moving? The answer is that the Yapese had unknowingly built the world's first distributed ledger. When someone paid with a Rai stone, what really happened was a transfer of ownership, logged in the community's collective memory. Everyone knew who owned which stone, and when a deal went down, the news spread quickly across the island. It was a public ledger kept not by computers, but by the oral tradition of an entire people. Imagine this. You're a tribal chief in Yap, 15th century. Your daughter's getting married, and you owe a dowry in the form of a 3-ton stone sitting on the other side of the island. You don't move it, physically impossible anyway. Instead, you publicly announce that the stone now belongs to the groom's family. The whole community witnesses and remembers. Transaction complete. The whole thing ran on absolute trust and collective memory. No banks, no written contracts, no central authority. Purely peer-to-peer, decentralized, transparent. 500 years before computers even existed. As the Rai system developed, it started showing traits we only fully understand now in the digital economy era. One of the most famous stories about Rai shows just how mind-bending this system really was. On one expedition back from Palau, one of the largest, most beautiful Rai stones ever made was lost at sea during a storm. The stone sank to the ocean floor, way too deep to ever recover. But the Yapese did something incredible. They kept using it as money. Even though it was gone, invisible, unreachable, it still got traded, inherited, and used in major deals. For generations, families based their wealth on a stone nobody had ever seen again. That reveals something profound about the nature of money. Its value doesn't come from physical form, but from collective belief. That stone on the seafloor was just as real as any Bitcoin in a digital wallet you've never touched. The Rai system even had built-in inflation control. Since creating new stones required costly, dangerous expeditions to Palau, the money supply was naturally limited. That artificial scarcity kept the value of Rai stones stable for centuries. But here's the most impressive part. They had a system for denominations. Small stones, coin-sized, worked for smaller trades. Medium stones, for big deals. And the massive ones, some over 12 feet wide, were reserved for society's most important transactions. In the 19th century, this 1,000-year-old system faced its first big stress test when Europeans arrived in Yap with iron tools and very different ideas about money and value. One of the most colorful characters of that era was David Dean O'Keefe, an Irish-American who shipwrecked near Yap in 1871. O'Keefe quickly realized how valuable Rai stones were and smelled a business opportunity. He started using modern iron tools to help the Yapese crank out Rai stones in Palau, in exchange for copra, dried coconut, and other local goods. At first, everybody won. The Yapese could produce more stones with less effort and risk. O'Keefe got valuable exports to ship abroad. But then something unexpected happened. The Rai system hit its first inflation crisis. Stones made with iron tools, though bigger and more perfect, were worth less than the older stones carved with primitive gear. Why? Because they didn't carry the same story of sacrifice and struggle. They were easier to make, so they were worth less. The Yapese had basically intuited a core economic principle. The value of something is tied to the effort it takes to get it. The modern stones were technically better, but economically weaker. So the system split into two classes. The old stones, handcrafted the hard way, kept their high value. The new stones, made with European help, were a second-tier currency. It was basically like having Bitcoin and Bitcoin Gold in the same ecosystem. But the arrival of Europeans brought even deeper change. Colonial disputes between Spain, Germany, and later Japan turned Yap into a geopolitical pawn. During World War II, some Rai stones were literally used by the Japanese as ship anchors. The irony? While Europeans tried to civilize the Yapese with coins and paper money, they never fully grasped the Rai system. To them, it seemed primitive and irrational. How could something have value if you couldn't move it or even touch it? Only decades later, in the digital age, did we start to see the genius behind it. The Yapes had nailed down concepts we now consider fundamental to modern economics: value based on consensus, distributed ledgers, programmed scarcity, and network validation. Today, when we talk about Bitcoin and blockchain, we're basically describing what the Yapese built over 1,000 years ago. The difference is, they use stones and collective memory. We use code and computers.